I'm Christopher Stonewald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to throw this out there. I have a channel over on YouTube, Life as a ... which basically hosts highlights from these audio conversations that I have with these great guests. They typically run 10 to 15 minutes, and they're there to kind of present a different vantage point. You know, for people that aren't into audio, aren't into podcasts, but are still looking for career advice, ideas, help, all that great stuff, send them over to YouTube. Like I said, Life as a ... And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. I mean, it's the best way to let that algorithm know that the content is worth sharing and should be out there. So anyway, I do thank you for letting me plug this a little bit, but I think it's about time to get into today's episode. How many of you are familiar with the video game SimCity? For those not in the know, this was and continues to be this wildly popular game in which the purpose is to build, plan, and design your very own city. Now, if you were to assign an actual professional career that most closely aligns to that game, you'd probably go with something like urban planning. However, you might be wondering how closely the game imitates real life. Well, spoiler alert here, it is much different in terms of what an actual planner is keyed in on to build, maintain, and modernize an actual metropolis. Surprise, surprise. And that's kind of the focus of today's episode. I've got this great guest, an actual urban planner named Danny Brown, who works within one of the most recognizable global cities in the world, Toronto, Canada, to take us behind the curtain of what this profession is all about. And trust me, there's a lot to unpack here, and I guarantee that after listening to all that he shares, you'll have an excellent sense of what this career option represents. Well, let me formally introduce him to you, and we can launch into it all. Danny Brown is an urban planner and works for the City of Toronto's Parks, Forestry, and Recreation Division as a project officer in the Park Design Special Projects Group. Now, in his role, Danny works on a range of strategic waterfront projects, including the revitalization of Toronto's Portlands, Tommy Thompson Park, the Western Beaches, and Toronto Island Park. And prior to his current role, Danny worked within multiple aspects of parks planning for the City of Toronto, including conducting development review to secure parkland from new development projects, advancing Toronto's citywide parkland strategy, and supporting a review of Toronto's city-owned golf courses. And before joining the City of Toronto, he worked as a consultant for the international firms Dialogue and Urban Strategies Incorporated. In these roles, Danny worked on high-profile, complex projects like the University of Toronto's St. George Campus Secondary Plan and the City of Stratford's Grand Trunk Community Hub, amongst others. And he's also a member of the urbanist collective Open City Projects, where he wrote about public space issues and helped develop the Design for Diversity Toolkit, a public space design and engagement resource that seeks to help practitioners build and sustain intercultural public spaces. In his punchier days, he helped lead several tactical urbanism initiatives in Toronto, including #SitTO, a public performance advocating for more public seating in Toronto's public spaces, an art and food lead activation of a vacant lot, and Save Jarvis, a protest action against the removal of bike lanes on Jarvis Avenue. And Danny holds a Master's of Science degree in urban planning with a specialization in environmental planning, where he undertook his master's thesis on the topic of civic crowdfunding. To close things out, Danny believes in the power of collective action, civic virtue, and leading with both your heart and data. So with all this noted, here is my conversation with Danny Brown. Yeah, so welcome to the program. How are you doing today, Danny?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Quite keen to get into this conversation as we were just speaking off air. This field that you're within, urban planning is one that's always, quite honestly, interested me. I remember taking a course on this in university. So I'm like I said, I'm keen to get into it all with you.
I'm excited to be here and hope to answer your questions thoughtfully, for sure.
Well, I do have this first segment lined up. It's something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners know, it's a segment where I just read off a definition of something related to what the guest does, and then after they share their comments.
So surprise, surprise, I do have you down here for urban planner. So let me just read this off according to what Wikipedia says what your profession's all about. So here we go. Urban planner. An urban planner, also known as town planner, is a professional who practices in the field of town planning or urban planning or city planning. An urban planner may focus on a specific area of practice and have a title such as city planner, town planner, regional planner, long range planner, transportation planner, infrastructure planner, environmental planner, parks planner, physical planner, health planner, planning analyst, urban designer, community development director, economic development specialist, or other similar combinations. It's quite the list. And quite frankly, it comes off as quite broad and doesn't really give a whole lot of information other than the fact that there's a lot of different ways of breaking down your world and your profession. How would you add some clarity to this?
For sure. Yeah, it says a lot. It's using a lot of words to say not a whole lot.
Exactly.
I like to think of urban planners as professional generalists. We sit at the intersection of a lot of more concrete or well-defined disciplines or other professions. So urban planning is a little bit of architecture, it's a little bit of economics, it's a little bit of ecology, it's a little bit of law, it's a little bit of, community engagement and education. And what we do is try and find the connections between all those sort of disciplines or approaches to how people live together in society. And we strategize about how to make people living in society work cohesively to improve the quality of life of people. That's one way of looking at urban planning. Another way, and maybe a more straightforward way of describing it, is that planners are responsible for the wise use of scarce resources. So whether those scarce resources are land, or money for infrastructure, or the availability of road capacity, we think a lot about how to make sure that everyone can make do with what is available to them. And so for that reason, it can involve a lot of different things. It can be transportation, it can be economic planning, it can be school planning, or even space planning within a building on its own, or how many buildings can you put in a given city or a community. And so it encompasses a lot of different disciplines and different approaches, but all of it really has to do with how communities function and how we can do that effectively and efficiently to realize different goals. And those goals can be subject to political winds, community desires, and the ethics and philosophies that may reign at any given era throughout time. This is a profession as old as there have been communities of people living together and having to think about how do we allocate resources among ourselves efficiently.
Well, first impression, I think you should be rewriting this Wikipedia definition. Yeah, that was really clear, and I think much easier to kind of digest. And the second thing I question here, follow up, is that this point that really struck me was like this generalist, like all these different areas that you're tapping into. Was this something that when you were getting into the field that you fully understood, or was this something that once you entered into it, you could really see how this all came together?
I don't think so. I think I've come to that, to embracing the idea of being a professional generalist as I've moved through my career as an urban planner. I think when I thought about getting into the profession and going back to school for it, I really thought it was more of a specialized profession. And I suppose you do specialize once you get into the profession. You start building a portfolio and a realm of experience in a particular set of expertise in planning. But I definitely thought it would be more cohesive as I got into it. I assumed that it would be more like SimCity, because that's sort of the popular conception of it. But it's really not. It's a lot more distributed and diffuse than that, and has a lot more soft skills than hard skills at the end of the day. We work with engineers to do, the building design or thinking about infrastructure. We work with architects and urban designers to think about the shape and form of a building. We work with lawyers to think about how those regulations interface with other things. We work with counsel and the public. So really, it's about communication, lateral thinking, creative thinking, and less so about, can you build a building yourself? That's what, constructors are for, and contractors and construction firms. So it's a little bit of everything, but in order to understand how they all work together, you have to see the connections between those things and how they interact with each other. And so coming to embracing generalism as a strength rather than a weakness, knowing a little bit about everything is actually an expertise in and of itself, and knowing how you can link those things together is the specialty, I think, of good urban planners anyway.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm picking up on this vibe too, that would also add a certain degree of fulfillment, like when stress and pressure, I'm sure at different points as well, no doubt, but also fulfillment and like getting to know all of these different areas and fitting these pieces of the puzzle together, and ultimately having this project that does get off the ground. We're going to get into this later, I'm sure. The challenges and difficulties, but also some of the rewards of bringing it all together.
Yeah, if you're someone who really likes knowing how the sausage gets made and wants to be part of that sausage making, you couldn't find a better profession than urban planning. You're involved at the outset from projects. Again, this depends on your expertise or your particular, realm of planning, but you're there at the start of a project. And, this might be a spoiler for where we get to. You're not always there at the end of the project to implementation, right? It's called planning for a reason. We're not doing necessarily. That's the big criticism, right? We're very good at planning things out, but I think a fair criticism is that there's not always or necessarily the follow through to the actual completion. So if you like big ideas, if you like big visions, if you see how the world could be better and want to start working towards that and have the patience and grit to get through it, then planning's for you for sure.
Maybe we could slide in this other segment here, a day in the life, and it is as it sounds, and to add some further clarity in terms of what you're doing. And once again, I mentioned this off the top, but I'll state it again. Your current work is with the City of Toronto's Parks, Forestry, and Recreation Division as a project officer in the Park Design Special Projects Group. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, what a typical day or even week looks like for you, if such a thing even exists.
So, that's the key, I think, is that it's always a little bit different. There's always different things that you're doing week to week. A lot of the projects are long term. So you're working on something and grinding away at it. And it could take 3, 5, 10 years to realize a project to fruition with all of its, bumps and circular routes and, L turns and all those kind of things. What does a typical day look like? It's a desk job by and large. So, I'm sitting on a lot of Zoom calls, I'm answering emails. But on my best days and the best weeks are where I get to go out on site to where the work is happening. I get to work with landscape architects, contractors, engineers, other folks in the community, Indigenous folks, and meet them on the land and go to the places where we're doing the work and think about how it could be different and how it could be used better for more people. And when it becomes collaborative in that way, when I'm moving away from my desk and actually sitting around a table or out in the space with other practitioners, with community members, that's really exciting. But the day-to-day is mundane. And I think that's how change really gets made and how a lot of work happens is you're, looking over plans and diagrams, you're writing memos to senior leadership or to city council, you're putting together PowerPoint decks. You're thinking a lot about how to convince people to make change on really complex projects. And that involves a lot of communication and a lot of collaboration. So yeah, it's a lot of meetings like this on Zoom or Teams. It's a lot of thinking about what's the best way to persuade someone, how to communicate complexity in really straightforward ways, and then how to actually translate that into, a real world impact for what you're proposing to do with anyone.
In terms of getting out into the field, for example, if we're looking at this on a weekly schedule, would you get out, say, once or twice a week, or is this something that's even less than that?
Again, it depends on the project. For some projects, we would be out there, a good planner, depending on their portfolio. If you're doing development review, for example, which is another kind of planning and something that I used to do in my career as well, you'd want to be probably out on site once every couple of weeks or so to, see the development sites that you're reviewing, to get a sense of the neighborhood. Ideally, you're fostering relationships in those communities with neighborhood groups or individuals or NGOs, service organizations, and you're meeting them where they're at to hear their concerns, to show them what's going on, to talk about the long range vision for the area. You're doing site walks, that kind of thing. The projects I'm working on right now are quite large scale in nature. And so I'm not out as often as I'd like to be. So it is, I would say maybe once or twice a quarter. I'm out there in the big spaces where I'm going, but that can ramp up when we get closer to a milestone in the project. So, on one project where I'm working on the waterfront in the west end of Toronto, I'm out there once every month or so. And then sometimes it's a couple times a week to, do a site walk with folks in transportation services to think about bike lanes and how people are using the trail. It might be getting out there to talk to folks from Toronto Water about an infrastructure project that they want to land in a park space. It's really varied and also weather dependent, of course. But yeah, I think it's more of an office job than not. There is the best days when you can get out there into the field.
How many projects typically would you be engaged with at any given time?
So, I mean, again, it depends on the scale of the project. I think you're going to hear that a lot from me today is that it depends. But I would say, between half a dozen to 8 projects at any given time. And some of those are subsets of other projects. And, again, some people might have more or less depending on what their particular realm of expertise was. It was not uncommon in the city of Toronto, for example, for some of our development planners who are working on development review to have upwards of like 20 projects at any given time in various stages of the approval process. And some projects might go dormant for 6 months or 8 months. So it might still be an open file for you, but you're not actually doing work on it day to day. But given, how fast Toronto's growing and how much activity there is, people are very, very busy at the city with projects.
Yeah, sounds like it. Okay. I got this other segment lined up here too. It's called Pathways, and it is as it sounds. I mean, the purpose is to kind of find out how people made their way into their work that they're doing right now. And I understand in researching for this that you were actually on a track at one point towards education. And I'd be curious to rewind a little bit back to that point. What was leading you down that path and what ultimately pulled you towards urban planning and got you veering off into that direction? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
In honesty, some of it was path dependency. Both my parents are teachers. When you're growing up as a kid, you spend a lot of time in school. That's what you're doing. And it always sort of felt like a natural fit to want to go into education. And would be where I ended up. It was familiar because both my parents were teachers. You spend a lot of time in schools and it felt like a good career to have. I'm also someone who really believes in the value of service and wanting to make a difference in society that might be painfully earnest, but that is important to me. And teaching felt like something that I could give back to my community and help make the world a better place through supporting the next generation. It was when I was really in teachers college and we were learning about the way that you can make social change through curricula and through teaching that I was more and more exposed to things like navigating and communicating climate change, navigating and communicating things like social justice. And it became more and more of a passion of mine, especially towards the later stages of undergrad. I was learning more about these things. And then I took sort of that passion for social change, for climate change action into teachers college, thinking about how can I implement this through my education practice. But I found that as I was doing my practice teaching and in the classroom, I wasn't feeling as fulfilled as I probably should have been about it. Then this is no knock to teachers at all. The job is very hard and it requires you to be in front of students day in, day out who may not want to be there. And I just knew, knowing myself in that classroom, that if I was, preaching to an unreceptive audience who might be more worried about like their test mark coming up or how do I get out of this classroom and into the real world, quote unquote, it wasn't feeling like I could really bring my full self to it. You're really performing when you're a teacher and you're doing it on a one-to-many basis. It's not as collaborative as I think I wanted my career to be. And so I knew that I was going to kind of be the kind of teacher who would burn out, I think, and maybe get a little unmotivated or disillusioned with it. Not to mention, I had a lot of concerns about how we approach teaching as an institution, how public education works in terms of a lack of resources. I think evaluation's a little wonky for what we want to achieve out of school. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation. I don't want to get sidetracked. But I then started thinking, well, if it's not teaching, what do I do then? What's my next step? But it always felt like something I wanted to do. I love education, but I don't think the classroom was right for me, or at least high school education wasn't right for me. So I reevaluated. I did, I think, what a lot of millennials do and take some time off to reevaluate and, quote unquote, find themselves. And I ended up, reading I was working for a video game company doing social media because I also loved to video game and it was, something fun to do for a little while I traveled. I realized I was spending a lot of my spare time at my desk reading about cities and about how cities can fight climate change and how cities are sort of on the forefront of that, and thinking a lot about as climate change barrels towards us, cities are at the forefront of keeping people safe and mitigating climate change and being resilient in the face of it. And I realized, hey, I think there might actually be something here. Surely there's people who work to manage cities. And I, did some Googling and it turned out, hey, here's a profession called urban planning. So it really wasn't until I finished university that I even got switched on to knowing that there was a whole profession out there called urban planning. And it was at that point, it was like, okay, well, if this is something I'm really obviously passionate about because I'm spending my spare time reading about it, and I still wanted to make change, I still wanted to be of service to my communities, and I wanted to fight climate change, maybe urban planning was for me. And I grew up also playing a ton of SimCity, not really thinking too deeply about it. It felt like a game. And I was a city kid born and raised. I'm born and raised in Toronto. So it all sort of felt like the sort of kismet of all my different interests fell into place with reading about urban planning, and got back from my travels and enrolled in grad school and had the privilege and luck to get in and go through the program. And the rest of the story is now my career in urban planning and specifically parks planning, getting to help build and design the green spaces of Toronto, create and protect habitat, and work to create more public space in a city that sorely needs it. So I feel immensely lucky to have found my path and my passion. But I think teaching helped me get there and to realize as much that I love education, and I do a lot of it in urban planning and in my job, I like service more, and I can do a lot more collaboration as an urban planner than I could as a teacher.
Yeah, a couple of things stand out there to me. Like one is this notion of career pathways never being or very rarely being linear, right? That's one thing that comes up over and over again in this segment on this program. And the other one is this notion of reflection. You really deeply considering and thinking along the way. And also, too, I'd even throw in, a dash of courage in there as well to make a big change. Like sounds like most of the way through teachers college at that point. I'd venture to say that a lot of people might just stick to that path, and to pull out and be like, no, this isn't right. I think there's a bit of courage in that as well. But ultimately, it sounds like you've landed in the right spot, based on what I'm picking up so far in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to acknowledge that I think I had the privilege of, family stability and a middle class background to be able to reevaluate at that point. I was immensely lucky to be in a position to have the luxury of reevaluating at that point after investing, 4 years of an undergrad and a year of teachers college to figure out that it wasn't for me, and then to have the opportunity to do something else and go to grad school. So, I mean, that's one thing. But the other consideration is that teachers college and education as a career was always still going to be there for me. I didn't see it as wasted time or as something that I couldn't go back to. If urban planning likewise didn't work out for me, I mean, I still enjoy teaching. Now in my mid 30s, I probably would have a different philosophy and a different resiliency to the idea of being in front of a classroom every day. But I think as much of my move away from education at the time may have also just been a product of being 21, 22. And I may have a very different approach to teaching now at 36 than I might have in my early 20s, having been in school my entire life and then staring down a career in school for the rest of my life. I might have been thinking differently about it than I am now. And I will say, I do go back and teach classes once or twice a year. My brother is a teacher, as it turns out, and he is gracious enough to invite me to speak to his classes every year. He's a geography teacher in part, and we do a little lesson on what is urban planning. So I haven't quite escaped it. And I don't imagine I will spend the rest of my career further removed from the classroom. I'm interested in teaching maybe a college class or two in the course of time. So I think I'll find my way back in front of a chalkboard sometime for sure.
All right. Well, I'd like to slide in this other segment here, Q&A Discovery. You can kind of continue this back and forth. And in terms of, getting back to your role and what you're doing within the city of Toronto, a city unto itself, especially a global one like Toronto, represents a lot. On the one hand, it's this global hub. It's driving regional economies. It's driving the city's economy, essentially. But then also, too, it's homes to millions of people, of course, and people that are carving out their own lives, living their lives there. And I'm guessing that there's this constant battle for more economic development, growth. But then you also have the needs of people that we need public spaces. We need parks. We need places to unwind and to relax. And this constant battle between these two parties. And I'm guessing here, as an outsider, being an urban planner, you're squarely in the middle of all of this and trying to balance these needs out. I'd love to hear that insight a little bit, and whether or not I'm even on track here, if my assumption is correct of, where your place and some of the challenges that you face within the role.
Yeah, you're exactly on target. It is an exceedingly challenging job because you are always compromising. And the very nature of compromise means that everyone by nature doesn't get exactly what they want. There's always a give and take, and there's always someone who's going to be slightly disappointed or put out by the decision. But on balance, what you're trying to do is optimize, again, going back to that wise use of scarce resources. You're trying to figure out what's the best way of balancing these inputs, these desires to achieve the collectively agreed upon outcome. And, I want to say at this point that what that collectively agreed upon outcome is always and historically dependent on power and who gets to determine what is the collectively decided upon outcome. So I think planning rightly has a bit of a challenging history when it comes to pointing at or achieving what was understood to be an optimal outcome. There's a lot, especially in North America, the assumption for a long time was that the best way to plan cities was to enable people to drive around by cars, for example. That was seen as the mutually beneficial outcome is people can have a home in the suburb and they'll drive into cities, and we're going to plan our cities accordingly because that is the optimal outcome. Everyone has their white picket fence, everyone has their own 2-bedroom home, and everyone can commute into the city, and that's where the office towers are, but everyone goes home to their little backyard. That, we have now learned, and there were vocal folks back in the 50s and 60s saying that too, but the collective sort of imagination was that was the outcome we were driving at. Now we're realizing that has really perverse outcomes and really suboptimal outcomes for community health, for cohesion, for climate change, you name it. We know our pattern of development in North America, by all metrics, is not achieving the outcomes we want it to, and can't. There's limited land. Not everyone can live in a suburb and commute to the city. That's how we get congestion. That's how we get greenhouse gas emissions, degradation of habitat, the list goes on. So instead, we're now reorienting and reacting to the planning of the past and kind of replanning and thinking about, well, how do we make our communities more livable, more dense, more equitable? But we're also addressing that legacy. And that means that we're dealing with a substantial amount of change in a city like Toronto and trying to encourage all of that growth to happen in a place that already has people living all over it. And so I think, at first there was a negotiation about, okay, well, if we can't have growth happen everywhere, it has to be managed in some way. The toilets need to flush. There needs to be places for people to park because we still are living in a car dependent community. We can't just turn off the switch and say no more cars everywhere. As much as I personally may like that, and I'm all for a transportation revolution and getting everyone on bikes and walking everywhere, the reality of things is that there are people who are using cars, and our logistical system, our infrastructure system is predicated on car movement. So you can't just close down streets. You can do it incrementally where it makes sense. You fight tooth and nail. I have colleagues who are trying to build bike lanes, and you're reading news articles about how tense some of those meetings are. But we also are a growing city where people want to live in a city. They want to live in a dense community. And that means we have to build housing. And so for a time, the decision was, well, let's build housing where it's easy. So close to the downtown core, on transit, where there weren't already a lot of houses, where, let's redevelop industrial land. Let's build it in places where it's not going to have impacts on other people. Well, we're kind of realizing we're at the end of that kind of supply of land, even in a city. There are no more quote unquote easy development sites in the city. So now the conversation is, well, how do we build more in a city where we kind of have to accept a trade-off? Like, yeah, there's going to be an impact on your single family home neighborhood. You might need to accept 4 stories of development in a neighborhood that has historically only had 2 stories of development. You may need to accept apartment buildings with 6 units in a neighborhood that typically only has 1 unit. And those conversations can be incredibly fraught. People who have lived in this city for decades are used to a certain, character of their community. And I know that some people listening to this podcast are going to roll their eyes at the concept of neighborhood character. But if I, stretch my empathy, I can imagine being, an 80-year-old Torontonian who have worked hard to land in the city and find a place for themselves in the city, feeling like the city has changed around them and having like an emotional reaction to that change. And it can be really hard to convince them of sort of the societal benefit of the change around them when they themselves are experiencing the change as construction disruption, as noise, as a vision of their life different from what they have lived with. And so, I have an enormous amount of sympathy for folks who are experiencing that change. But I also, from an objective point of view and from, a planning perspective, and as a young person also growing up in the city, staring down climate change and knowing what I know now about urban planning at history, I'm realizing we need to shift the levers of power, and we need to, some of that change needs to happen, and it's going to inconvenience some people. But from my perspective, that inconvenience is worth it for the collective outcome of building safer, more inclusive, more equitable, more affordable cities. And if that means that someone's single detached house now has a little bit of shadow on their backyard because the building 2 doors down is 4 stories instead of 1 or 2, like that's a trade-off as an urban planner in 2024 I have to make. And I'm helping make those decisions, cognizant that they're going to be upset with me. But that is the reality, because I also have a duty to the generations that come after me and to the other people who don't own a home with a backyard in the city. So yeah, that's the trade-off. It's exceedingly difficult, and you can imagine how emotional it can get. We've all seen the articles and maybe TikTok videos or snippets on YouTube of really tense community meetings, and yeah, they can get really heated. But these are people's lives, right? It's what's local to them.
Yeah, no, that's really well put. And I think it sort of gives us a nice synopsis of some of the challenges that somebody like yourself would face in the work that you're involved in. I mean, the other thing that struck me when I was listening to you speak is the fact that you understand the changes that need to be made, but within your line of work, these are things that take years and decades to enact, right? It's not like turning a light switch on and off and suddenly you've got a green city. Like, these things take time, and they take lots of conversations, and then they speak to the issues that you were just explaining there, like on a micro scale where you're impacting individuals or families' lives and trying to get them to buy into this future vision of, where the city has to go ultimately. But yeah, I can see the challenges there.
And I think it's worth pointing out too that planning doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Like, gone are the days of your Robert Moseses or your other sort of centralized planners that are drawing lines on a map, and there's government money unlocked and a highway gets bulldozed through a neighborhood. Historically, typically predominantly Black and poor neighborhoods is where those lines were drawn to, drive highways through and that kind of thing. We don't have that planning approach anymore. I think the pendulum has swung very far in the direction of like local community control of planning. And, people talk about NIMBYism, for example, so not in my backyard. And there's an immense amount of power in established neighborhoods and landowners to resist that change. And planning exists in the context of democracy and government politics and all of those compromises and challenges. And so we're not just, waving a magic wand or clicking send on an email and suddenly bulldozers are out there, making change. We're negotiating with developers. We're communicating change to our local councillor. We're talking to engineering about, is there enough capacity in the sewer? If not, how long do we have to wait until the sewer can be upsized? Where's the money coming from? Oh, does the new sewer line have to go into a park because it can't go under a road? Well, what does that mean for the park? Does that mean how many trees need to get destroyed? What's the trade-off? Where do you plant the new trees? Like, it is exceedingly complex to get a toilet to flush. And there are so many different levers and considerations you have to think of that it's not as simple as playing SimCity and dragging some zoning over a space and houses and towers pop up. I wish it would be a lot cheaper if we could do that. And, we're making strides where, there's mass timber and prefabricated buildings and lots of other ways to speed up the building of housing in the city. And I think we could be doing a lot more to speed it up. but we can't do it by fiat. It's got to take time, and it's got to take consideration of how it's going to affect people and what all the knock-ons are. As soon as you build a building, that's real people. It's not just a building. And those people are going to have kids. Those kids are going to have to go to a school. They might have a dog, so that dog's got to go run around somewhere. Maybe you want to enroll in a swim class or learn how to take karate lessons. You got to build a community center. You got to have a library and fire services and paramedic services. And all of that needs to be collectively negotiated and thought about. And so, there's also a lot of just analysis paralysis. Where do you go? Every decision you make means you're not making another decision, right? Back to that wise use of scarce resources. As soon as you choose to do something, you are foreclosing on all the other things you could do in that space. And so it can be really hard to say what is the best option here. And so that's where you're trying to find the balance between working with the local community, thinking about your obligations to the future, but also pushing inside of a system that is controlled by elected officials who have their own motivations and desires and opinions about what should happen and the quality thereof, right? If they are beholden to interests that are not aligned with the local communities or aligned with yours, then you got other outcomes. And that's without getting into all the other sort of planning philosophy of the fact that Toronto exists within the province of Ontario. And the province of Ontario makes decisions that the city then has to follow. And we don't necessarily have control over certain things. So it's enormously complex. But again, if you love knowing how the sausage gets made and wants to be part of that process, that's the career. That's what you do.
Yeah. I mean, I can definitely see that. It would have to appeal to a certain type of person. I myself, in listening to this, my head is almost swimming with all of this, what you're sharing though, because it returns to what you're speaking about, this point of being a generalist and having a base of knowledge within this sphere, and having a basic understanding, or more than a basic understanding, it sounds like you would need to be able to kind of bring all these puzzle pieces together to actually enact some sort of change or development. Mm-hmm. But I've got this other question here in terms of surprises that you might have in the work itself, being a planner. I'm assuming you're trying to minimize some of these surprises that might come across your plate at different points, but all the same, I'm guessing that they still occur. And to what degree does that pop up? Or where you're at in your career right now, have you reached a point where you're like, well, I've seen just about everything that's going to come my way. You can't surprise me anymore. To what degree does that sort of issue come into your life and your profession?
Yeah, it happens all the time. Every project has something that will surprise you, or you'll get a tidbit of local knowledge that changes your entire perspective on how something can be used. So, I mean, here's an example. I worked on a review of the Toronto golf courses a couple of years ago. Our contracts with our operators were coming up, and the city said, let's take a look at the city-owned golf courses. What do we want to do with them? Does it still make sense to use them as golf? If there's still going to be golf, what should we do? With all the other associated questions about how do you use space, and golf courses are a contentious use. We were trying to figure out how people were using the golf courses, both as golf courses, but there's also other things that happen on them. And it was surprising to me when we were trying to do some of this data about some of the results that we were getting, and it just didn't square. We had golf numbers of how many people were using a course. And for the sake of argument, it was 50,000 people. When we got back some of the data that we were using anonymous cell phone data to see how many people were actually using it and where they were coming from, we were getting something like 10 times as many assumed users of this golf courses than we had people playing golf from the actual data of ticket purchases. And it was what the heck is going on here? Obviously, there might be something wrong with the data. Maybe we're picking up something strange. And what we realized was that a lot of people were using the golf course as a cut through to get to the transit station, because the golf course was in between a pretty significant apartment complex and the transit station. And a lot of people were cutting through it, cutting through the fence and using it as a informal shortcut. And that was being picked up by the geofence in our cell phone data. And it was a mind blow moment. That people are using the golf courses as informal open space outside of regular hours, whether or not they're allowed to or not. That's not the conversation we're having, right? People are going to use space to suit their needs. And the way that we control space may not align with how people want to use that space. That's a whole other conversation. But people were using it as their backyard, as their shortcut. And it led to a recommendation to say, maybe we should use a portion of this golf course as parkland, recognizing that it's up against this apartment neighborhood, that people are using it otherwise. By the way, this golf course is the smallest that we have. It's also not generating a ton of money for us. People said it's their least favorite. So on balance, maybe this is a good opportunity to realize some other use on it and do some other golf stuff on it later. It didn't end up happening. It's another story. But it was an aha moment for me to be like, this is where something that, you kind of knew informally, but when the data actually reflects it and you see the magnitude of it, you're realizing these are real people's lives that you're seeing through the data, and they're addressing a challenge, access to transit, in sort of an unconventional or informal way. And the city you look at on Google Maps is not the city experienced by people on a day-to-day basis. And that gets replicated on every project I'm on. There's always something to learn, and best learned by talking to the people who are using that space day in, day out. So that's why I really say the best days are when you're out on site, talking to people, learning about the actual space, because you can't do planning from behind your computer, or at least you can't do good planning from your computer. You have to go out and see the space.
I love that insight. I think that's one that you just wouldn't get from a textbook. You wouldn't get from just about anywhere. But that's such a major portion, as you said, of what the work is all about, and really getting to know, like you said, borrowing that word, the needs of the people, and how a city reflects on paper is not how it actually, looks or operates in reality. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I really appreciate that insight there. I have this one last question within the segment. I'd love to hear a little bit more about, the meaning that you assign to your work. Projecting into the future, maybe down the line when you are hanging things up and you're looking back at your career, to this point at least, like what would you hang your hat on? Like, what are some of the moments or some of the things that you're proud of?
For me, it's been a long realization of my career so far of sort of hanging up my cape and that superhero complex. I think a lot of people go into planning, and I'm going to be a little self-deprecating here. And I've said this to my friends too in planning, so I don't think this is out of turn. But I think people go into planning because they think they know better than other people and can make better decisions. But I have learned an enormous amount of humility, which, is maybe ironic to say, but I do mean that genuinely. You get into this, I think, wanting to make change, right? Wanting to be that person who flips the switch and revolutionizes a city, that makes it different overnight. The reality is none of this happens overnight. It is a constant grind of small wins, incremental change that over time add up to meaningful shifts in culture or people's experience of a city. So I really can't point to any one thing, but I can point to dozens of small things that I've been able to do. And I think what I've realized is that there isn't going to be a period where the work is finished and I look back and go, I'm done. It's finished. I did it. Like, I accomplished it. Instead, there's only the work. That's why they call it work, because you just keep doing it. There's more work to be done after me. There's lots of work that I'm doing that is dependent on the work that came before me. So I will be part of a long process of generations of work to build a city that I love, that other people love. And it's going to continue to be great as long as people who love it continue to invest in it and continue to do work in it. So, I mean, there are small things here and there that I'm proud of. I'm proud of the efforts I put into some of my projects. I'm proud that on that golf project, there wasn't a decision to turn one of the golf courses into a more accessible public park. But we did get opportunities put into the procurement process to encourage more and score higher vendors who would incorporate Indigenous economic development opportunities. We got commitment from City Council to look at introducing more trail connections through the golf courses to allow more people to use them. We got more people to think about urban agriculture opportunities on golf courses and get some pressure put on the community gardening initiatives in the city to think more about food growing. And those have legs. That sparked a conversation up in North York about building a trail that we hadn't directly recommended, but the conversation had started, and now the community is picking it up and moving with it. I'm proud that in the Portlands, we've got this huge part of the city, formerly industrial space, where we're digging a new river and turning that all into mixed use development and a ton of new parkland, I'm proud that I'm working with my colleagues in city planning and waterfront Toronto to generate some more funding that will go towards parks to help us build the kind of spaces that were there and to encourage more Indigenous public art, for example, in those spaces and craft policy to move the needle slightly in the direction of accomplishing the outcomes that we want. I'm a cog in a much bigger machine, and I'm proud of being as good of a cog as I can be and just doing the work in that capacity.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, what was kind of going through my mind is like this notion of macro scale to micro scale. Some of the changes that you're planning for one, and then also like instituting and the way it comes down, of course, on paper, you have these big macro changes, but then again, returning to that point of how it impacts individuals in a daily sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at it from a reflective standpoint and your role as a cog, as you said, in helping
Mm-hmm.
all of this come to fruition, and if you're seeing results that, are leading to better outcomes or, positive impacts on the community, there's got to be a certain degree of reward and fulfillment associated with all that. I can definitely see that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not to wax too poetic about this kind of stuff, but the grand march of like human civilization is doing things together, doing big things that no one human can do alone. So I do think it's kind of silly to think about like, what are you proud of, Danny Brown, individual planner? It's like, it's not honestly about me. It's about how I can help everyone else with my particular skill set make the big change, right? No one's digging that new river alone in the Portlands. No one's building all those parks alone. No one's planting a tree alone most of the time, short of the tree planters who are out there for, half a cent per tree sapling that they're doing. But you know what I mean, right?
Yeah,
like the grand works of our time, the city of Toronto and the space that was here before colonization is a result of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people making small changes every day, day in, day out. And that's all we can do is help be part of that civilizational project of continuing to be good humans to each other and living in balance with this world that we've got. It's the only one we have right now.
Well, I do want to shift on over into another segment here, and I'm going to count your golf story as our water cooler story segment there. And that's going to bring us to a crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And in terms of this segment, I mean, quite honestly, it most often tracks back to AI and the role that it's playing, across industries, across professions. And I'd love to hear about what kind of impact you're seeing from it within your field at the moment.
Yeah. So thinking about AI specifically, like any tool, it's as useful as the people using it and to what end they're using that tool. I think there's a lot of value in AI for urban planning, especially when it comes to like growth and development planning. There's been some really interesting applications I've seen out there where planners can plug in, parameters based on policy that's established, and it gets plugged into a geographic information system, like essentially mapping software with a little bit of like 3D software layered on top. You plug in the parameters and it spits out different configurations of a building that could be on any given site. That kind of like site development process can take a lot of time thinking about the many, arguably too many layers of regulation and built form guidelines and urban design considerations and shadows and angular planes and setbacks and step backs. And like the list goes on of the requirements. But what AI can do is instead of having like an architectural intern who, let's be honest, is probably not being paid enough to grind away at trying to come up with a building shape that fits within all of those parameters, which most likely it won't because every site is different. And so then you get into a long drawn out conversation with city planning at the city who's saying, well, we said your building can only be 6 meters high at the ground level and you're showing me 8, and like that's too high. Like an enormous amount of time is spent wrangling at the edges. AI is something that can be like, well, here are all the rules you've put into place, city X. This is the building you're going to get. And it can kind of just like spit out a template for any given site, which might reduce a lot of the friction and or may convince city planners like, hey, in this case, actually your policies mathematically will not produce a functional building because every site is different. And it might help us get to yes faster, which at the end of the day is going to help us make housing more affordable. So I think of it from a housing perspective, and layering on numbers into the real world, I think it has enormous application. And actually then will free up planners to do what we are better at, which is not looking at a plan and measuring whether it's 5 meters when the policy says 4. It's, well, what's the bigger picture here? How does this building contribute to the greater scheme of the vision for the area? How do you work to educate and convince the locals that this is actually a good outcome? How do you then collaborate better with the school boards to say, well, look, we're anticipating another 300 residents here in 10 years or 5 years, as the case may be. How do we get ahead of our space planning needs? And you can start to be a little bit more proactive, which ideally is what planning is doing, is being proactive. But a lot of our work is reactive, or at least responsive to change, instead of being proactive and setting up the stage for change. When it comes to things like open space planning, or like what I do in parks planning, AI can be really useful in doing large scale data analysis. Some of that work I was alluding to with the golf course, we couldn't really separate the signal from the noise effectively enough using the anonymous cell phone data. I think AI, with big enough data sets, enough information plugged into it from like a community recreation perspective. Imagine we could input every field permit, event permit, picnic permit, recreation class signed up for across the city of Toronto into one of these big models, and one of these large AI models could sift the data for us and start spitting out patterns for us. I think we could do a lot more responsive planning. Maybe this is where we need a cricket pitch, not just based on like raw data about like where are the cricket pitches in the city, where is there a gap? Like that's pretty surface level. But like where are we actually modifying programs or shifting on the fly or being dynamic in terms of what kind of services we offer to the city? There's an enormous application out there for AI if there's appetite and a desire to do it, and if we have the technology available to us as city staff to do that kind of thing.
Do you see
I don't think it's as much of a risk.
That's my next question, is what kind of threat do you see it, posing or presenting to the profession?
Yeah, to the same extent that, a highway can be good or bad depending on what it's used for, right? Like a highway that facilitates, autonomous trucking from one place to the other using electric trucks, great, wonderful, great way to move goods from a place to another. A highway that you drive through a low income neighborhood because you want, ex-urban residents, largely white and wealthy, to get into the city to go to their finance jobs, like not a great use of a highway as a tool, right? Same with AI. If you're using it to make better decisions about a city, wonderful. If you're using it to create really compelling misinformation, or using AI to doctor a video to make cyclists look bad, for example, or make dog owners look bad. Choose your bugbear depending on what nefarious actor you are. It can be really toxic and dangerous. So I think, as with the rise of social media, media literacy insofar as AI interfaces with media is going to be really important. And that's where I think you really have to rely on good data and sort of principled and ethical practitioners and put some guardrails on it. And that's also why things like local democracy are going to be so important in community conversations about change. So you're not ceding all this control to a script, essentially a programmatic script that's going to tell you what the best outcome is, because then you have to ask the question, well, who's programming that script in the first place, right? But I'm optimistic. I am a techno-optimist at heart, and I do think there's enormous opportunity there to make our cities better. But I'm cautious about how it could be deployed to wrong ends. But that's with anything.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, time and time again, when I have these conversations with professionals in all types of industries and professions themselves, it always comes down to this notion of AI being this tool. And it's an interesting time right now, because I think we're all still trying to figure out, what those guardrails are, for it itself, and how we can sort of use it in a safe and responsible and ethical manner. And that's the time we're in right now, is we're still trying to figure all of that out as the technology is continually evolving and advancing. So yeah, time will tell.
I think it has enormous potential to free up like human capacity to do things that humans are good at, which is make connections and collaborate with other humans rather than reviewing a form for accuracy, right? To make sure every T and I was crossed. Like let's be fair, that's not a good use of the wonders of human imagination. What we can better do as planners and others is to be humans with each other and accomplish amazing things, and let the robots and the AI handle the work that we don't need to do, or that's dangerous, or devoid of any creativity or real thought, right? Free up the pencil pushers to do some good community building rather than having them make sure that there's a stamp on every page of the drawing that was submitted to the city,
I love that. I love that insight there. And this might be a nice point to wrap things up here. But I've got to say, Danny, we've just blown through this conversation. I've loved every second of it. And I know myself, I feel like I've learned a ton in the course of, listening to you speak on, what your work is about and what you do. And I know listeners are really going to enjoy it. So I can't thank you enough for taking some time and joining the program.
Well, I'm so glad. Thank you so much for having me on. And I hope people are interested in urban planning. I haven't bored them too much.
Absolutely. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Chris.
Now, for those interested in learning more about Danny and his work, you can do so via LinkedIn. And for reference, I will have a link within the show notes. Also, hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share to show further support. You can always rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And lastly, as I did mention off the top, I do have that YouTube channel, Life as a ... I would love if you head on over there and give the program a like, or better yet, a subscribe. Now, finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.